It has been 100 days since Nancy Guthrie vanished from her Foothills home. The 84-year-old mother of Today Show host Savannah Guthrie was last seen the night of January 31st. Investigators from the Pima County Sheriff's Department and the FBI continued to analyze evidence found at the scene, working to find those responsible for her believed abduction.
On Mother's Day, Savannah Guthrie posted a video compilation to her Instagram account. Home video footage, family photographs, a mother and daughter across decades, birthday parties, holiday mornings. The ordinary architecture of a life shared between two people who never expected to be separated by anything other than time. The caption beneath the video read, "Mother, daughter, sister, Nani, we miss you with every breath. We will never stop looking for you. We will never be at peace until we find you." And then, the part that functions as both a plea and an indictment. We need help. Someone knows something that can make the difference. Call 1-800-CALL-FBI. You can be anonymous and the reward remains available. She closed with 7 words. Please keep praying. Bring her home. That post was published on the 10th of May, 2026. 101 days had passed since Nancy Guthrie was taken from her home in the Catalina foothills north of Tucson, Arizona. 101 mornings, 101 nights. And the person who knows what happened to this 84-year-old woman has not come forward. Not even for $1 million. That fact demands attention, not passive attention, forensic attention. Because the silence surrounding this case is not random, it is structured. It has a shape. And understanding that shape is essential to understanding where this investigation stands on day 101 and where it must go next. This is True Crime Hex. This channel is dedicated to investigating the cases that demand more than a headline, and this case demands more than any headline has been willing to carry. Hit the like button on this video. Subscribe to True Crime Hex if you have not already. Every subscriber, every like, every share of this content helps push this story further into the world, and this story needs pushing. Because 101 days in, the institutional forces responsible for finding Nancy Guthrie are not aligned. They are in conflict. And that conflict has consequences. Let us be precise about where things stand.
They are working hard to get this case resolved, and I think every day they get closer. Day one, the FBI was involved in this case, and they continue to be involved in this case. Every single day, we continue to work with our labs, whether it's on the digital end or the biological end, DNA.
On the 12th of May, 2026, Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos sat for an interview with the local station KOLD. It was day 100 of the investigation. His message was measured. They are working hard to get this resolved, and I think every day they get closer, Nanos said of his investigative team. He confirmed that the FBI has been involved since what he called day 1. He described ongoing work with laboratories on both the digital and biological ends, specifically citing DNA analysis. And then he said something that deserves scrutiny. It moves at a snail's pace, I guess for some, but for my investigative team, and for me, we look at this as, no, this is doing exactly what we need it to do. That framing, that the pace is appropriate, that the process is functioning as designed, would be reassuring if it came from an institution operating with full cohesion. It does not come from such an institution. It comes from a department whose leader is now facing a unanimous vote of no confidence from his own deputies, a bipartisan effort by county supervisors to compel his sworn testimony, and public allegations that he actively discouraged cooperation with federal authorities. The distance between doing exactly what we need it to do and the reality of this investigation is where the truth of this case currently resides. Consider what happened with Pima County Assessor Suzanne Druby. Druby's office received information relevant to the Nancy Guthrie case. Her office, acting in what appears to have been good faith and in compliance with an FBI request, shared that information with federal investigators. The response from Sheriff Nanos, according to Druby, was not gratitude. It was a scolding. Because the information she shared with the FBI created additional leads that his department now had to pursue, let that register. A county official complied with a federal request in an active kidnapping investigation. The sheriff of the county where that kidnapping occurred responded by scolding her. Not because the information was wrong, not because the protocol was violated, because it created work, because it generated leads. In a case where an 84-year-old woman has been missing for over 3 months, the elected head of the investigating agency treated the creation of new leads as a problem rather than a necessity. That is not a management disagreement. That is a diagnostic indicator. It tells you something about how this investigation is being run. It tells you something about the relationship between local and federal authorities. And it tells you something about why, on day 100, the person who took Nancy Guthrie has not been identified. The conflict did not begin with Suzanne Drewby. It began earlier, and it became public in a way that should concern anyone following this case. On the 5th of May, 2026, FBI Director Kash Patel appeared on the program Hang Out with Sean Hannity. During that appearance, Patel made a direct allegation against the Pima County Sheriff's Department. He stated that the department attempted to keep the FBI out of the investigation for 4 days at the outset of the case. 4 days. In a potential kidnapping. In a case involving an 8 to 4-year-old woman. In a case where the first 48 hours are the window where the subject is most likely to be recovered alive. The Pima County Sheriff's Department responded with a statement that read, in part, while the FBI director was not on scene, coordination with the Bureau began without delay. That statement does not actually deny the allegation. It reframes it. Coordination began without delay is not the same as the FBI had full and immediate access. And the parenthetical, while the FBI director was not on scene, is a rhetorical dismissal, not a factual rebuttal. It says, you were not there, therefore your account is secondary to ours. That is not how interagency cooperation works in a case of this magnitude. That is how territorial disputes work. And territorial disputes and kidnapping investigations cost time. Time costs lives. The Pima County Board of Supervisors has taken notice. On May 12, the same day Sheriff Nanos gave his Day 100 interview, the board voted unanimously to use an old territorial law to compel Nanos to give sworn testimony about his work history and other matters. The context for that vote is not solely the Guthrie case. Nanos has been accused of falsifying information about his work history going back to his time at the El Paso Police Department in the 1980s. He has been accused of perjury in a sworn deposition. He has been accused of misrepresenting his credentials on his public resume, in media interviews, and in reports to county leaders. But the Guthrie case has concentrated the existing dysfunction into something with immediate, observable consequences. Republican Supervisor Steve Christie, who has called for Nanos to resign, said it plainly during the May 12 board meeting. There really is no wonder why we're having such a horrible and horrific time trying to solve this very tragic case, and it's really laid directly on the sheriff's shoulders. That statement came from a member of the sheriff's own party. The criticism is not partisan. It is structural. Democratic Supervisor Matt Hines, who has also called for Nanos to resign, was present at the same meeting. Supervisor Rex Scott, while not calling for resignation, stated that Nanos has exhibited poor leadership and cited the unanimous no-confidence vote from the Pima County Deputies Organization as the most telling evidence. The board voted to refer allegations of potential perjury to the Arizona Attorney General's office. This is the institutional environment in which the Nancy Guthrie investigation is being conducted. A sheriff facing a no-confidence vote from his own deputies. A sheriff accused of perjury. A sheriff who allegedly scolded a county official for cooperating with the FBI. A sheriff who, according to the FBI director, attempted to delay federal involvement at the most critical phase of the investigation. And a board of supervisors that has now used territorial-era law to force that sheriff to testify under oath. Every subscriber, every like, every share of this content helps push this story further into the world. Because these institutional failures are not abstract, they have a direct and measurable effect on whether Nancy Guthrie is found. Give this video a like so that more people find this coverage. The algorithm does not care about an 8, 4-year-old woman in Tucson. The people watching this do, and the more people who watch, the harder it becomes for institutional dysfunction to operate in the shadows. Now, let us move from the institutional to the evidentiary. Because, while the Sheriff's Office and the FBI have been engaged in what appears to be a quiet war over jurisdiction and access, the physical evidence in this case has been doing what physical evidence always does. It has been sitting there, waiting, patiently, indifferent to politics, indifferent to ego, indifferent to the human failures surrounding it. Here is what the evidence has established. Blood was found on the front porch of Nancy Guthrie's home. That blood was confirmed through DNA analysis to belong to Nancy Guthrie. That is not a circumstantial finding, that is a biological fact. Nancy Guthrie bled on her own porch. The quantity and pattern of that blood has not been publicly disclosed by authorities, but the confirmation itself establishes a threshold of violence. An 8-4-year-old woman does not bleed on her own front porch in the middle of the night without cause. The cause, in this context, is not ambiguous. She was taken, and the taking involved force sufficient to draw blood. The doorbell camera at Nancy Guthrie's front door captured footage of an individual at approximately 1:47 a.m. on the 1st of February 2026. That individual is described by the FBI as a male, approximately 5'9" to 5'10" tall, with an average build. The footage shows this individual appearing to tamper with the camera. He was armed. The FBI released images from this footage on February 10, 9 days after the disappearance. The images show a person in dark clothing, with gloved hands, reaching toward the doorbell camera. The camera was disabled. That is the last confirmed visual evidence of anyone at Nancy Guthrie's door before she was taken. At 2:28 a.m. on February 1, Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker recorded activity. The specific nature of that activity, whether it was a spike consistent with physical distress, a steady reading consistent with continued movement, or an irregularity consistent with medical emergency, has not been publicly released by authorities. But the fact of the reading itself is significant. It means that at 2:28 a.m., roughly 41 minutes after her doorbell camera was disabled, Nancy Guthrie's heart was still generating data. She was alive, or, more precisely, her pacemaker was still interacting with a living cardiac system. Whether she remained in the home at that time or had already been removed is a question the evidence does not yet answer publicly. But the 4-1-minute gap between the camera's disablement and the pacemaker's reading is a window. It is a window during which an armed individual was inside or around Nancy Guthrie's home, and during which Nancy Guthrie was experiencing something that her pacemaker recorded. Whatever happened in that window is the core of this case. And whatever the pacemaker data shows is something that the laboratory analysis, the biological and digital work Sheriff Nanos referenced, may still be processing. DNA evidence was recovered from Nancy Guthrie's property. That DNA did not belong to Nancy Guthrie. It did not belong to anyone known to be close to her. And it did not match any entry in the FBI's combined DNA index system, known as CODIS. That last fact is critical. A CODIS no-hit means one of two things. Either the person who left that DNA has never been arrested for a crime that required DNA collection, or the DNA sample was of insufficient quality to generate a profile suitable for comparison. Given that the Sheriff's Department has confirmed the DNA exists and has confirmed it did not match CODIS, the sample was apparently of sufficient quality to run, which means the person who left that DNA at Nancy Guthrie's home has no prior criminal record that placed their profile in the federal database. That narrows the pool in one direction and expands it in another. It eliminates anyone with a prior felony conviction, a sex offense registration, or certain misdemeanor convictions that trigger DNA collection. But it keeps the pool wide open for anyone without a record, which includes the vast majority of the population. This is where investigative genetic genealogy becomes essential. And this is where the institutional conflict matters most. Investigative genetic genealogy, the process of using publicly available DNA databases to identify familial relationships and narrow toward a suspect, does not rely on CODIS. It relies on databases like GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA, where individuals have voluntarily uploaded their genetic profiles for ancestry and genealogical research. The technique has solved cases that were decades cold. It identified the Golden State Killer in 2018 after 40 years of silence. It has identified remains. It has closed doors that CODIS could not open. But investigative genetic genealogy requires two things. It requires a DNA sample of sufficient quality to generate a full profile, and it requires an investigative agency willing to pursue that avenue with the same rigor it would apply to any traditional lead. Deborah Stone Barger knows this. Barger is a former senior criminalist whose expertise in forensic laboratory work spans decades. In a recent interview, Barger addressed the Nancy Guthrie case directly, and her analysis cut straight to the structural heart of what is happening and what is not happening in this investigation. Barger stated that the scaling back of staffing on the Guthrie case is, in her assessment, normal for this stage of an investigation. The initial surge of personnel that floods a high-profile case in its first weeks is not sustainable, and it is not necessary. What is necessary, what cannot be scaled back, is the laboratory work, the DNA analysis, the genealogical leads, the biological processing that turns unknown DNA into a name, or at minimum, into a family tree that leads toward a name. Barger's analysis went further. She stated that, in her professional opinion, more than one person is likely involved in Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. That assessment is not speculation. It is an inference drawn from the totality of the evidence. An 84-year-old woman, taken from her home in the middle of the night, from a neighborhood that requires knowledge of the terrain to navigate. An armed individual on camera, a doorbell camera disabled with apparent familiarity, blood on the porch, DNA of an unknown individual inside the home, and a $1 million reward that has produced silence. That silence is itself evidence. Not physical evidence, structural evidence. Barger addressed this directly. A $1 million reward in a case of this visibility, in a community of this size, should produce leads. The fact that it has not produced leads sufficient to identify a suspect tells you something about the people who have information. It tells you they are afraid. Not of the legal consequences, necessarily, of the personal consequences, of what happens to someone who provides information about a crime where more than one person is involved. Because if more than one person committed this crime, then every person with knowledge of it is a witness to the actions of someone willing to abduct an 84-year-old woman at gunpoint. That is not a category of criminal who inspires confidence in the safety of informants. The fear is rational, but the fear is also exploitable, and the way to exploit it is through sustained, visible pressure, sustained public attention, sustained investigative presence, sustained reminders that the reward exists and that anonymity is guaranteed. The FBI tip line 1800-CALL-FBI is open. Calls can be anonymous. The reward is active. $1 million. And still, silence. That silence has a structure. Barger identified it. The silence is not ignorance. The silence is fear. And fear is a form of knowledge. It means someone knows enough to be afraid, which means someone knows enough to solve this case. A pair of black gloves was found approximately 2 miles from Nancy Guthrie's home. The gloves visually resembled the gloves worn by the suspect in the doorbell camera footage. DNA was recovered from those gloves. That DNA did not match any entry in CODIS. 2 CODIS, no hits. 2 separate DNA samples, one from the property, one from the gloves, and neither one matches the federal database. This is not a dead end. This is a signpost. It points directly toward investigative genetic genealogy. If CODIS cannot identify the source of this DNA, genealogical databases might. They have done so in cases far older and far colder than 101 days. The question is whether that work is being done. Sheriff Nanos referenced DNA analysis in his Day 100 interview. He referenced laboratory work on the biological end, but he did not specify whether genealogical analysis had been initiated. He did not name the laboratory conducting the work. He did not provide a timeline for results. And in the absence of specificity, the public and the Guthrie family are left to trust a process being managed by an institution whose leadership is under active investigation for perjury. That is the reality, not a conspiracy. A documented, verifiable reality. The head of the agency responsible for finding Nancy Guthrie is simultaneously fighting to keep his job, fighting allegations that he lied under oath, and fighting the perception supported by the FBI director's own statement that he impeded federal involvement at the outset of the most critical phase of this investigation. None of this means the investigators on the ground are not doing their work. The deputies, the forensic technicians, the analysts, they are not the sheriff. They are professionals operating within a system that their own leadership has compromised. Barger made this point implicitly. The scaling back of personnel is normal. The scaling back of laboratory work is not. And the laboratory work does not depend on the sheriff's political survival. It depends on funding, prioritization, and access to the right analytical resources, Astrea Forensics. The name has come up in this case before. Astrea is one of the premier laboratories in the United States for extracting nuclear DNA profiles from degraded or limited samples, single rootless hairs, touch DNA, trace evidence of the kind that conventional laboratories struggle to process. If there is a laboratory best equipped to extract a nuclear DNA profile from the unknown samples in this case and turn it into a foundation for genealogical identification, Astrea is that laboratory. Whether the Guthrie evidence has been sent there, or to a laboratory of equivalent capability, has not been confirmed publicly. Hit the like button on this video. Subscribe to True Crime Hex if you have not already. Every like is a signal that this story is reaching people who care. And people who care are people who might call 1-800-CALL-FBI. That number exists for a reason. Use it. On the 7th of May, 2026, the Tucson Police Department confirmed that a human bone had been found approximately 7 miles from Nancy Guthrie's house. For a brief period hours, not days, that discovery carried the weight of every family's worst fear. A bone. 7 miles from the home of a missing 84-year-old woman. The connection seemed, for those hours, unavoidable. The bone was prehistoric. It was not Nancy Guthrie's. It was not connected to this case in any way. It was a fragment of ancient human remains in a region where such fragments are not uncommon. The announcement that it was unrelated came quickly. But the emotional impact of those hours, the spike of dread that moved through everyone following this case, is worth naming directly, because it has a real effect on real people. Every false lead, every speculative report, every unverified claim that gains traction online does damage. It forces a family to process the possibility of the worst outcome before the evidence supports it. and then it forces them to process the reversal. That cycle is exhausting, it is cruel, and in the Guthrie case, it is avoidable. The prehistoric bone is not the only false lead that has circulated in this case. Online speculation has produced theories ranging from ransom-related abduction to targeted retaliation to random opportunity. Some of these theories are grounded in fragments of evidence. Most are not. The distinction matters. Nancy Guthrie was taken from her home. Blood was found on her porch. DNA of an unknown male was found in her home. An armed individual was captured on camera disabling her doorbell. A pair of gloves with DNA was found 2 miles away. None of that is speculation. That is the documented evidentiary foundation of this case. What that evidence does not support yet is a definitive conclusion about motive. The doorbell footage shows a person who appears to have come prepared. The gloves, the weapon, the deliberate disabling of the camera, these are the actions of someone who planned this. Someone who knew the home had a doorbell camera. Someone who knew where it was positioned and how to reach it. Someone who understood, before they arrived, what they would need to do to avoid visual identification. That level of preparation is not consistent with a random burglary. It is not consistent with a crime of opportunity. An opportunistic criminal does not, as a general pattern, arrive armed, disable a surveillance device, and then abduct an elderly woman from her bed. That sequence requires planning. It requires reconnaissance. It requires knowledge of the target, or at minimum, knowledge of the property. And that brings us back to the question of more than one person, Barger's assessment. Because while one person can plan and execute an abduction alone, the evidence in this case suggests a level of logistical complexity that becomes more probable with more participants. Someone disabled the camera, someone entered the home, someone moved Nancy Guthrie from the home to a vehicle or another location. Someone cleaned or attempted to clean the scene, or chose not to, depending on the forensic findings that have not been publicly released. And someone has kept her or information about what happened to her hidden for 101 days. That is not a single-person operation in most forensic reconstructions. It is a coordinated act. And coordinated acts leave traces in the social fabric around them. Co-conspirators talk, not always, but often enough that the absence of any tip at all in response to a $1 million reward is itself a forensic signal. It says, the people who know are more afraid of the perpetrators than they are motivated by the money. And $1 million is a significant motivation. The fear must be greater. Savannah Guthrie returned to the Today Show on the 6th of April, 2026. She had been absent since February. In an interview with Hoda Kotb before her first day back, she explained her decision. It's hard to imagine doing it, because it's such a place of joy and lightness, she said. I can't come back and try to be something that I'm not, but I can't not come back because it's my family. I think it's part of my purpose right now. I want to smile. And when I do, it will be real. My joy will be my protest. My joy will be my answer. And being there is joyful. My joy will be my protest. That is not a throwaway line. That is a woman who has spent over 2 months in the worst kind of uncertainty, not knowing whether her mother is alive or dead, not knowing whether the investigation is being handled with the urgency it demands, not knowing whether the system she is being told to trust is actually functioning, choosing to re-enter public life not as a gesture of resignation, but as an act of defiance. She is protesting. She is answering. And her answer is, you have not broken this family. On May 13, one day after the 100-day mark, Savannah Guthrie reshared a post from her Today colleague, Carson Daly, on her Instagram story. Daly had cited a Bible verse and written, "Keep praying, no matter how hopeless life may seem. God can change your entire life in a single moment." He added, "Bring her home." Guthrie reshared it. That act, the resharing, the endorsement of the message, is a continued public insistence on hope, not naive hope, not passive hope, insistent hope, the kind of hope that says, we are watching, we are waiting, and we will not accept silence as an answer. The Guthrie family has been consistent in their public messaging. They have not attacked the sheriff's department. They have not publicly criticized the investigation. They have focused on 3 things: the reward, the tip line, and prayer. That restraint is notable. A family with the media platform that the Guthries possess could have used that platform to apply direct political pressure. They have not. Whether that restraint is strategic or personal or both is not for public speculation. What is observable is the effect. The institutional failures in this case have not been forced into the spotlight by the family. They have been forced into the spotlight by the institutions themselves. By the FBI director's statement, by Suzanne Drewby's account, by the Board of Supervisors' vote, by the deputy's no-confidence declaration. The family has kept its focus on finding Nancy. The system around them has collapsed on its own, And that collapse matters. Because every day that the investigation is hampered by institutional conflict is a day that the biological evidence degrades, a day that the trail grows colder, a day that the window for recovering Nancy Guthrie alive, if she is alive, narrows further. Deborah Stone Barger's central point was this: the laboratory work must not slow down. The DNA analysis must continue. The genealogical leads must be pursued, not at the pace of a snail, as Sheriff Nanos characterized it, at the pace that the evidence demands. And the evidence in this case demands urgency. Consider what is at stake. 2 DNA samples of unknown origin, one from the property, one from the gloves. Neither matched CODIS. That means the next step is not more waiting. The next step is genealogical analysis, sending the DNA profiles if they have not already been sent to a laboratory capable of running them against genealogical databases, generating a family tree, narrowing the field from the entire population to a cluster of related individuals, and then pursuing traditional investigative work within that cluster. This is not theoretical. This is the methodology that has solved hundreds of cases in the past 8 years. It is the methodology that identified Joseph James DeAngelo as the Golden State Killer in 2018 after 4 decades of failure. It is the methodology that identified the suspect in the 1974 murder of Rita Curran in Burlington, Vermont, a case that had gone cold for 50 years. It is the methodology that identified remains found in 1987 as those of a missing teenager in California, closing a case that had lingered for nearly 40 years. In every one of those cases, the conventional database CODIS had failed, and in every one of those cases, genealogical analysis succeeded. Not because it is magic, because it accesses a different pool of genetic data, a pool built by millions of people who uploaded their DNA to ancestry services, never imagining it would be used to solve crimes. But it is, and it works. The question for the Nancy Guthrie investigation is not whether this methodology exists. It does. The question is whether it is being applied, whether the DNA samples from the property and the gloves have been submitted for genealogical analysis, whether the results, if they exist, are being acted on with the urgency that a 1-day-old kidnapping demands. Sheriff Nanos said in his Day 100 interview that the FBI has been involved since day 1. He said that laboratory work continues on the digital and biological ends. He said that his team is getting closer every day. Those statements are reassuring in form, but form is not substance. And the substance of this investigation, the evidence that will identify who took Nancy Guthrie, is not in the sheriff's statements. It is in the DNA. It is in the genealogical databases. It is in the laboratory work that Barger correctly identified as the element that cannot slow down. The institutional conflict between the sheriff's department and the FBI is not a side story. It is the main story of this investigation's dysfunction, and it has a direct, measurable impact on the pace and quality of the laboratory work. Because DNA analysis is not something that happens in isolation, it requires coordination between the collecting agency, the analyzing laboratory, and the investigative team that follows up on the results. If the relationship between the local agency and the federal agency is compromised, if the sheriff's department delayed FBI access, if the sheriff scolded a county official for cooperating with the FBI, then the coordination that laboratory work requires is compromised. The samples still get analyzed, the profiles still get generated. But the follow-up, the actual investigative work of narrowing from a genealogical hit to a named suspect, that work depends on functional interagency cooperation. And that cooperation in Pima County is broken. The Board of Supervisors' decision to compel Nanos to testify under oath is a step toward accountability. But accountability in this context is not about punishing the sheriff. Accountability is about removing the obstacle. If the sheriff's leadership is compromised, if his own deputies have declared no confidence, if county officials are being discouraged from cooperating with federal investigators, if the FBI director has publicly stated that the department impeded federal access, then the obstacle to finding Nancy Guthrie is not the absence of evidence. The obstacle is the absence of functional institutional coordination, and Nancy Guthrie does not have time for institutional reform. She has had 101 days stolen from her. Every additional day that passes while these institutional failures are resolved through political processes rather than investigative urgency is a day that cannot be recovered. That is not a political statement. That is a forensic statement. Because the evidence in this case, the blood, the DNA, the doorbell footage, the gloves, the pacemaker data, is subject to the same laws of entropy that govern all physical evidence. DNA degrades. Trails go cold. Witnesses' memories fade. The probability of recovery decreases with time. That is not speculation. That is documented fact. And yet, $1 million in reward money remains unclaimed. An FBI tip line remains open. and the people who know something remain silent. That silence is the most important piece of evidence in this case that no laboratory can analyze, because it tells you that the people with knowledge are afraid. And fear, as Barger noted, is a consequence of the nature of the crime. A crime committed by more than one person generates more fear in potential witnesses, because there is more than one person to fear, more than one person who might retaliate, more than one person who might identify the informant and act against them. That is why the public visibility of this case matters. That is why Savannah Guthrie's continued public presence matters. That is why every social media post, every news article, every video like this one matters. Not because attention solves crimes directly, but because attention changes the calculation for the people who are afraid. Attention increases the probability that someone, a neighbor, a family member, a coworker, will decide that the risk of silence has become greater than the risk of speaking. Attention increases the pressure, and pressure, in cases built on fear, is the only force that moves silence toward disclosure. Every subscriber, every like, every share of this content helps push this story further into the world. Every like is a signal that this story is reaching people who care, and people who care are people who talk. People who talk are people who call 1-800-CALLFBI. Give this video a like so that more people find this coverage. The algorithm does not have a conscience, but it has a function. And that function, when directed by the attention of people who refuse to look away, can carry this story to the person who knows something and is afraid. That person needs to see that the world is still watching, that the reward is still there, that the tip line is still open, that anonymity is guaranteed, that one call can change everything. Let us return to the evidence. Because the evidence, unlike the institutions, has not failed. It is sitting there. It is waiting. The doorbell camera footage. The FBI described the individual in that footage as a male, approximately 5'9" to 5'10" tall, with an average build. That description is general enough to match thousands of people in the Tucson metropolitan area. But the footage itself contains more information than the description suggests. The way the individual moves, the way they reach for the camera, the way they position their body relative to the door, the way they handle the weapon. These are behavioral markers. They are not as precise as a fingerprint, but they are not nothing. A trained analyst in the FBI can extract behavioral inferences from video footage that go beyond height and weight, gait analysis, handedness, familiarity with the environment. The individual in that footage moved with purpose, not the hesitant purpose of someone exploring an unfamiliar property, the practiced purpose of someone who knew where they were going and what they were doing. That behavioral evidence, combined with the DNA evidence, creates a composite, not a name. Not a face. The footage does not provide a clear facial image, which is precisely why the camera was disabled, but a profile, a behavioral and genetic profile that, when combined with genealogical analysis, can narrow the field dramatically. The gloves found 2 miles from the home. Their visual similarity to the gloves in the doorbell footage establishes a potential chain of evidence. The DNA on those gloves is a second sample of the same unknown profile, or, if it is a different profile, it is a second unknown individual. That distinction matters. If the DNA on the gloves matches the DNA from the property, it strengthens the case against a single perpetrator. If it does not match, if it is a different profile, it supports Barger's assessment that more than one person was involved. Either way, the gloves are evidence, and their recovery 2 miles from the home suggests a route, a direction of travel after the crime, a path that might correlate with traffic cameras, residential surveillance systems, or geographic features that channel movement. 2 miles in the Catalina foothills is not 2 miles on a flat grid. The terrain is elevated. The roads follow contours. The residential developments are separated by natural features, washes, ridges, open desert. Someone driving 2 miles from the Guthrie home at 2 a.m. on a February night would have passed through a specific set of intersections. Some of those intersections have cameras. Some of the homes along those routes have surveillance systems. The FBI and the Sheriff's Department have reportedly canvassed for surveillance footage. What they have collected, and what that footage shows, has not been publicly disclosed. But here is what is known. Several vehicles were observed in the vicinity of Nancy Guthrie's home around the time of her disappearance. Reports have referenced surveillance footage capturing cars near the property. The number of vehicles, their descriptions, and their direction of travel have not been released in detail. But the existence of vehicular evidence separate from the individual on foot captured by the doorbell camera is consistent with Barger's multiple perpetrator theory. Someone disabled the camera on foot. Someone else may have been waiting in a vehicle, or the same person may have returned to a vehicle after completing the initial approach. Either way, a vehicle implies transportation, and transportation implies a destination. That destination, wherever Nancy Guthrie was taken, is the single most important unknown in this case. Not who, where. Because if you find where, you find who. And if you find where, you find Nancy. The $1 million reward is specifically for information leading to Nancy Guthrie's recovery, not the arrest of a suspect. The recovery of Nancy Guthrie. That distinction is significant. It signals that the family's priority is not prosecution. It is return. It is finding her. Alive, if she is alive. And if she is not, and that possibility must be faced honestly, then finding her remains so that the family can bury her with dignity and the forensic evidence associated with her remains can be collected and analyzed. Because if Nancy Guthrie did not survive this abduction, her remains are the most important evidence in the case. They contain the forensic record of what happened to her. They contain, potentially, additional DNA from the perpetrator or perpetrators. They contain evidence of cause and manner of death that can be presented in court, and they contain the answer to the question that has haunted this family for 101 days. The recovery of remains does not end an investigation. In many ways, it transforms an investigation. A missing persons case becomes a homicide case. The evidentiary standards change. The investigative tools change. The legal proceedings change. But the laboratory work, the DNA analysis, the genealogical pursuit, does not change. It continues. Because the same genetic signatures that were left at the Guthrie home and on the gloves are the signatures that will identify the person or persons responsible, whether the case is classified as abduction or homicide. That is why Barger's insistence on laboratory continuity is so important. The work does not slow down because the case classification changes. The work does not slow down because the public attention wanes. The work does not slow down because the institutional leadership is in crisis. The work continues because the evidence demands it. And the evidence in this case, the blood, the DNA, the footage, the gloves, the pacemaker data is sufficient to support a genealogical identification if it is processed correctly and pursued with urgency. The urgency is real, not because of the emotional weight of the case, although that weight is enormous, because of the forensic timeline. The first 48 hours of any abduction are the window of maximum probability for live recovery. That window closed in early February. The next window, the window during which physical evidence is most likely to be recoverable and witness memory is most likely to be reliable, closes more slowly. But it does close. At 101 days, that window is narrowing. Not closed, narrowed. The fact that the DNA samples were collected early in the investigation works in favor of the case. DNA does not degrade significantly when properly stored. The samples from the property and the gloves, if they were collected and stored according to protocol, are as viable today as they were on February 1. But viable samples only matter if they are analyzed. And analyzed samples only matter if the results are pursued. And pursued results only matter if the institutional framework conducting the pursuit is functional. Which brings us back to where this analysis began. The institutional framework in Pima County is not functional. It is fractured. And that fracture has a cost. The cost is measured in days. Days without genealogical results that should have been available weeks ago. Days without the kind of interagency coordination that turns a genealogical hit into a suspect identification. Days without the trust between local and federal investigators that allows information to flow freely rather than being hoarded or obstructed. Days when an 4-year-old woman's fate hung in the balance while the people responsible for finding her were fighting each other. That is not a narrative invention. That is the documented, verified, on-the-record reality of this investigation. FBI Director Kash Patel said the department tried to keep the FBI out. Suzanne Druby said she was scolded for cooperating with the FBI. The Pima County Deputies Organization declared no confidence in Sheriff Nanos. The Board of Supervisors voted unanimously to compel his sworn testimony. Supervisor Christie said the failures in this case are laid directly on the sheriff's shoulders. And Sheriff Nanos responded by saying the investigation is doing exactly what it needs to do. Those statements cannot both be true. Either the investigation is functioning optimally, or it is being compromised by the documented institutional failures. The evidence, the institutional evidence, not the forensic evidence, does not support the sheriff's characterization. It supports the characterization offered by his critics, and Nancy Guthrie does not have the luxury of waiting for that conflict to resolve itself. Savannah Guthrie's Mother's Day post was not just a tribute. It was a timestamp. It marked 101 days. It marked the persistence of a family that has not been allowed to grieve because they have not been allowed to know. They do not know if Nancy is alive. They do not know if she is being held. They do not know if she suffered. They do not know if she is suffering now. They know only that she is gone, and that the system responsible for finding her is, At best, moving at what the sheriff himself called a snail's pace. The Guthrie family has conducted itself with extraordinary restraint. They have offered $1 million. They have promoted the tip line. They have shared their grief publicly in the hope that visibility generates information. And they have trusted, or at least publicly deferred, to the institutions responsible for the investigation. But 101 days tests trust. 101 days tests faith. 101 days of not knowing whether your mother is alive or dead, while watching the institutions tasked with finding her collapse into public dysfunction that tests everything. The forensic evidence in this case has not failed. The blood on the porch has not failed. The DNA in the home has not failed. The doorbell footage has not failed. The gloves have not failed. The pacemaker data has not failed. Every one of these pieces of evidence is doing exactly what evidence is supposed to do. It is sitting there, waiting to be read correctly, processed thoroughly, and pursued with the urgency that a kidnapped 8-4-year-old woman deserves. The failure is not in the evidence. The failure is in the institutions, and the cost of that failure is measured in days, 101 of them, and counting. The laboratory work must continue. The genealogical analysis must be pursued. The DNA must be matched not against a database that has already returned no hits, but against the broader genealogical databases that have solved cases far older and far colder than this one. The FBI must have full and unimpeded access to every piece of evidence, every lead, and every analytical result. The Sheriff's Department must cooperate, not because the FBI director demanded it, not because the Board of Supervisors compelled it, but because Nancy Guthrie's life, or the truth about what happened to it, depends on that cooperation. Deborah Stone Barger said it plainly. More than one person is likely involved. The silence in response to the reward suggests fear. The laboratory work must not slow down. That is the forensic assessment of a seasoned criminalist who has seen cases at this stage before. It is not a political judgment. It is a professional one, and it should be treated as the roadmap it is. Process the DNA, run the genealogical analysis, identify the family cluster, narrow to the individual. Cross-reference with the doorbell footage, the height, the build, the behavioral markers. Cross-reference with the vehicular evidence, the cars near the home, the routes out of the neighborhood, the surveillance footage that may exist along those routes. Cross-reference with the gloves, the location, the DNA, the visual match to the footage. Build the composite. And then, when the composite is built, move. Move with the urgency of someone who understands that every day matters, because every day does matter. Not in the abstract, motivational sense. In the concrete, forensic sense. Evidence degrades. Trails go cold. The probability of resolution decreases as a function of time. That is not opinion. That is the statistical reality of long-duration abduction cases, and Nancy Guthrie's case is now a long-duration case, 101 days. Over 3 months. That is not the longest a missing person has been held and recovered alive. Cases exist of recoveries after months and even years. But those recoveries are exceptions, and they are exceptions that required extraordinary investigative effort. Not snail's pace, urgency. The community around this case can contribute, not by speculating, not by generating theories without evidence, not by amplifying unverified claims, but by calling 1-800-CALL-FBI if they know something, by sharing verified information about the case, the reward, the tip line, the suspect description with people who might not be aware of it, by maintaining the kind of sustained, visible attention that makes silence more uncomfortable for the people who are holding it. Savannah Guthrie said it on Mother's Day. We need help. That is not a passive statement. That is an active request. And it is addressed to everyone watching, everyone who has read about this case, everyone who has thought about this case, everyone who has wondered whether there is anything they can do. There is. Call the tip line. Share the case details. Keep the pressure on. Not on the sheriff, that is the Board of Supervisors' job. The pressure that matters is the pressure on the silence. The pressure on the people who know something and have not spoken. Make it harder for them to stay silent. Make the reward more visible. Make the anonymity guarantee more credible. Make the absence of Nancy Guthrie more intolerable than the fear of speaking. That is what sustained public attention does. It does not solve crimes. It creates the conditions under which crimes become solvable. It creates the environment in which a fearful witness decides that the risk of speaking is outweighed by the risk of continued silence. It creates the social pressure that turns withheld knowledge into disclosed information. 101 days, $1 million, an FBI tip line, DNA evidence that has not yet been matched to a name. doorbell footage of a suspect who has not yet been identified, a sheriff in crisis, a department in conflict, a family in anguish, and an 8-4-year-old woman whose location remains unknown. That is where this case stands, not at a dead end, at a decision point. The evidence exists, the methodology exists, the resources exist. What is in question is whether the institutional framework responsible for deploying those resources is capable of doing so with the coherence and urgency that this case demands. The answer to that question will determine whether day 101 is the beginning of the end of this case, or simply another marker on a timeline that continues to lengthen while the evidence waits. This is True Crime Hex. We stay until there are answers.